The dog came to her out of the storm 3 nights before Michaelmas, and that small accident undid a great house. Eleanor Wren had been crossing the lower meadow with a basket of windfall apples when she heard it. A thin, broken sound under the wind. More breath than bark. The rain had come sideways since noon, and the lane had turned to a river of brown water, and any sensible woman would have kept her head down and walked the last half-mile to the cottage she shared with her aunt. She did not keep her head down. She set the basket against the stile and went toward the sound, her plain gray gown already heavy at the hem, her boots filling with cold, and she found the animal half sunk in the ditch where the bank had given way. It was a tall hound, lean and trembling, its coat the color of wet ash, and a leather collar at its throat carried a small silver plate she could not read in the dark. She did not stop to read it. She went down into the ditch after it, and she came up with the dog against her chest and the mud to her knees, and she carried it home through the worst weather of the autumn, because it was alive and afraid, and she could not do otherwise. To the village she was, by then, only the seamstress who had come down in the world. That was the whole of her, as the village understood her, a woman of 29, whose father had once held a respectable living, and who now took in mending for the farmers' wives, and turned callers for the curate. She had been something else once. She did not speak of it. What she did not yet know, kneeling on her aunt's hearth with the hound steaming before the fire, was that the silver plate at its throat was engraved with the crest of the Duke of Harrogate, and that by saving the creature she had set her own small life directly in the path of the largest house in the county. If you have ever loved something the world told you was not yours to love, stay with this a while. Eleanor's whole story turns on a single act of stubborn kindness, and I would not have you miss where it leads. The hound was called Argent, though Eleanor learned that later. It would not leave her side. Through the night it lay against her like a second fire, and in the gray of the morning, when the storm had blown itself thin and the lane had begun to drain, it followed her to the door and pressed its long head into her hand and would not be left. So she did the only honest thing. She walked it up the long avenue to Harrogate, 3 miles of dripping limes, with the collar's silver plate now legible in the daylight, and her heart going faster the nearer she came to those iron gates. The house rose out of the morning mist like something that had decided long ago that it did not need to be liked. Gray stone, 100 windows, a forecourt wide enough to wheel a carriage and 4. Eleanor had never been nearer to it than the boundary wall. She stood at the foot of the great steps in her mended gown with the Duke's dog leaning warm against her leg, and she felt the full weight of the place look down at her, and she made herself climb. The man who received her at the top of the steps was not a servant. She understood that at once, though she could not have said how, for he wore no mark of rank she could name. He was tall, and the morning light came hard across a face that had been built for severity, a strong jaw, a straight, unforgiving mouth, dark hair cut close, and eyes of so pale a gray they seemed nearly without color at all. He looked at the dog. He looked at the woman holding the dog. Something moved behind the pale eyes, and was gone before she could read it. The hound left her side then and went to him, and he went down on one knee on the wet stone in his fine, dark coat and put both hands into the animal's wet ruff and bowed his head over it. And for the length of 3 heartbeats he was not a great man at all, but only a person who had got something back that he had thought lost. Eleanor looked away, because it was not a thing she had any right to see. When he stood, the severity had closed over the face again, like ice over a river. Mad. He was Adrian Vane. She would learn Marquess of Stonefield, the Duke's only son and heir, and he had ridden the storm-broken country half the night, looking for this dog, and he did not thank her. He said, his voice low and level, "Where did you find him?" She told him. The ditch below the lower meadow, the bank gone, the water rising. She kept her account plain and short, the way she kept everything plain and short in the presence of those above her, and she did not mention the cold of the ditch nor the 3 miles she had carried him, nor the night she had not slept. He listened without expression. When she had finished, he looked at her hem, stiff now with dried mud to the knee, and at her hands, which were chapped and reddened with the work she did, and at her face, which she had schooled to show nothing. "You are wet through," he said. It was not a kindness. It was very nearly an accusation, as though her being wet were a fault she had committed against him. Come inside. She did not come inside. A woman of her station did not walk into Harrogate, and she knew it, even if he, in the strange country of his rank, had forgotten it. She said she would be missed at home, and she dropped the small curtsy that closed such conversations, and she turned to go down the steps before he could turn it into an order. Behind her she heard the dog whine low, and she heard the Marquess say nothing at all, and she walked the 3 miles home with her wet skirts slapping her shins, and the memory of those pale gray eyes following her the whole way like weather she could not get out from under. She thought that was the end of it. It was not the beginning of what she expected, either. The note came the following Tuesday, carried by a liveried groom on a horse worth more than her aunt's cottage, and it was not from the Marquess. It was from his father, the Duke of Harrogate requested, in a hand grown spidery with age but still entirely certain of itself, that Miss Eleanor Wren attend him at the great house on a matter of some importance to them both. There was no question of refusing a duke. Her aunt pressed her one good gown, the cream muslin that had been new in another life, and brushed it until the worn places hardly showed, and Eleanor went up the avenue of limes a second time with her stomach a cold knot and no dog this time to lean against her leg. The Duke of Harrogate received her in a library the size of a chapel, floor to ceiling with books, a fire roaring against the autumn chill, though it was scarcely noon. He was a small man, gaunt to bones and white hair, propped in a great chair with a rug across his knees, but his eyes, when they found her, were the same pale gray as his son's, and twice as sharp. Argent lay at his feet, and thumped its tail once when it saw her, and did not rise, which told Eleanor the dog had been forbidden to rise. She curtsied, and waited. "You are the seamstress," the Duke said. "The one who brought my hound home through the flood." She agreed that she was. "Bain tells me you would not come inside." Something that might have been amusement crossed the ancient face. Sensible. This house eats people who come inside without knowing the way out. He studied her for a long moment, head tilted, and Eleanor had the distinct sensation of being weighed on a scale whose other pan she could not see. "Sit down," he said. "I am dying, and I have not the patience to watch a woman stand." She sat. She did not know yet that the sentence she had just heard would rearrange the whole of her life. The Duke came to it without ceremony. He was dying, as he had said, of a complaint his physicians dressed up in Latin and could not mend, and he had perhaps a season left, perhaps less. His son, the Marquess, was unmarried at 34, and showed no sign of correcting the omission, and the Duke would not go into the ground, leaving the line unsecured, and the estate exposed to a nephew, he named once, briefly, with a contempt that needed no elaboration. The nephew was a Mr. Crail, a smiling man of expensive habits and patient malice, and if the Marquess did not marry and get an heir, Crail stood next in the entail, and Crail had been circling Harrogate for 2 years the way a crow circles a sickbed. "My son will not choose," the Duke said. "He had a wife." "You will not have heard of it. You are too far down to hear of it, which is precisely why I want you. She died, and the manner of it is his to tell or keep, and he has decided no one shall stand in her place. I have decided otherwise." He leaned forward, and the rug slid from his knees, and neither of them moved to retrieve it. "I am told you are gently born, a clergyman's daughter, fallen on hard times through no folly of your own." Is that the truth of it? It was the truth of it. Her father had been the rector of a good parish until a bad investment and a worse friend had taken the small fortune that should have been her portion, and his health had gone with it, and she had nursed him to his grave at 26 and come to her aunt with nothing but her needle and her name. She said as much plainly because she could not see how a lie would serve her. "Good," said the Duke of Harrogate. "Then here is my proposal, and I will make it only once. I will settle upon you a sum that will keep you and your aunt in comfort to the end of your days, whatever else comes of it. In exchange, You will marry my son." The fire cracked. Argent's tail moved once against the floor, and was still. "He does not know I mean to ask you," the Duke went on, watching her face with those terrible pale eyes. "He will be angry. He is always angry. It is the only weather he keeps. He is also a man who pays his debts, and you put a debt on him 3 nights ago that he does not know how to carry, and I intend to give him a way to carry it. You return to him the one creature in this world he still permits himself to love. I am returning the favor by giving him a wife who is not afraid of a wet ditch. Now, what do you say?" What Eleanor said, after a silence in which she could hear her own pulse in her ears, was that she would need a day to consider it. The Duke laughed, a dry, rattling sound, and said that a day was more than most people had the courage to ask of him, and that she might have her day. And so she walked the 3 miles home a second time with the world tilted clean off its axis. A clergyman's fallen daughter, who had carried a dog out of a ditch and been offered, in payment, the heir to a dukedom she had never been permitted to enter. She did not sleep that night either. She said yes. Of course she said yes, though it shames the telling to put it so baldly, for the truth was tangled with things she could not say even to her aunt. She said yes, because the settlement meant her aunt would never again wake in the night doing sums against the winter. She said yes, because a woman of 29 with a needle and a fallen name had no other door open to her, and a closed life is a closed life however quietly one bears it. Underneath those reasons, which she could speak, ran another she could not, and it had pale gray eyes and had gone down on one knee on wet stone for the love of a frightened animal, and she did not examine it too closely for fear of what she would find. The Marquis found out the way the Duke had promised he would, which was after the fact and entirely against his will. Eleanor was brought to Harrowgate to be told of the settlement and the date, and she was standing in the great library when the door came open without a knock, and Adrian Vane filled it, and she understood at once that he had only just been told. The cold face was not cold now. It was white with a fury so complete it had gone past heat into something like frost, and the pale eyes found her across the room and held her pinned. "Out!" he said to the room, and the servants went, and the door closed. And they were 3. The dying Duke in his chair, and his furious son in the doorway, and the seamstress between them in her cream muslin gown. "You will tell her it is a mistake," the Marquess said to his father, and his voice was very quiet, which Eleanor was learning was the most dangerous register he owned. "You will tell her you spoke without my knowledge, which is true, and you will settle on her whatever you have promised, and she will go home, and we will not speak of this again." "I will not," said the Duke. "I had a wife." The Marquess said it to the room, to the books, to the fire, to anyone but her. "I will not have another. You know why." "I know why you tell yourself," the old man answered. "It is not the same thing." And then, more gently than Eleanor had thought him capable of, "Adrian, look at her. She walked 3 miles in a flood to bring you back the only thing you let yourself want. The least you can do is look at her." He looked at her. It was the second time, and it was nothing like the first. The first time on the steps he had looked at the dog and then at the woman holding the dog, and she had been an incident, a circumstance, wet and inconvenient. Now he looked at her as a man looks at a sentence handed down, and Eleanor stood very straight under it and did not look away because she had spent 3 years being looked at as a problem to be solved, and she had learned that the only dignity left to her was to refuse to flinch. Whatever he saw in her steadiness, it stopped him. The fury did not leave his face, but it changed, the way a fire changes when the wind shifts, and he was quiet for a long moment. "You agreed to this," he said to her. "Not a question." "I did," said Eleanor. Why, she might have spoken of the settlement. She might have spoken of her aunt and the winter sums. Instead, she heard herself say, in the plain, short way she kept for her betters, the only true thing that mattered. "Because I have nothing to lose by it, my lord. And your father has offered me something to gain. I am not afraid of you. I have already seen the worst of you on the steps, when you could not be bothered to thank me." A woman knows where she stands with a man who will not pretend. The silence after that went on a long time. The Duke, in his chair, made a small sound that might have been a laugh, smothered at birth. And the Marquis looked at Eleanor as though she had said something in a language he had given up expecting to hear, and the frost in his eyes did not so much break as quietly, privately, begin to thaw. They were married 11 days later in the estate chapel, by special license, with the dying Duke watching from a chair carried in for the purpose, and Argent lying across the chapel threshold like a gray sentinel, and not above a dozen people to witness it. Eleanor wore the cream muslin, retrimmed by her own hand. The Marquess wore his severity like a third garment over his coat. They spoke their vows in level voices, and when the moment came for him to take her hand, his fingers closed around her chapped, reddened ones with a care so deliberate it was almost an apology, and she felt the warmth of him go up her arm and settle somewhere beneath her ribs, and stay there. She did not let it show in her face. She was learning already that this was a house where what one felt and what one showed were two different countries. She had thought, going into it, that she understood the bargain. She would be a wife in name, a body in a chair at the foot of his table, a hostage against the smiling nephew's claim. And in exchange she would be safe, and her aunt would be warm. She had not bargained on the man himself, on the slow, accumulating fact of him, on the way a marriage of pure convenience can begin, against every intention to fill with something neither party has agreed to. It began with small things, as such things do. He did not come to her rooms, and she had not expected him to, but he did other things she had not expected. He learned that she rose early and walked the grounds at first light, and he began to be there, on the terrace, with 2 cups of chocolate and the dog, saying nothing, walking beside her in a silence that was somehow not cold. He learned that she had been schooled above her later station, that her fallen father had taught her Latin and a little Greek, and the whole of the library he had been forced to sell, and he began to leave books where she would find them, never with a word. Simply a volume turned face up on the morning room table that had not been there the night before. He issued commands that were not commands. It is cold. Sit nearer the fire. You have not eaten. Eat. Do not walk the east wood alone. Crail's men have been seen at the boundary. She heard the orders. She was slow to hear. Under the orders, the thing the orders were guarding. One gray afternoon, in the 3rd week of her marriage, she came upon the truth of him, or the first edge of it, and she came upon it by accident, the way she came upon most important things. She had gone looking for a book in the long gallery where the family portraits hung, generations of pale-eyed veins in the dress of their centuries, and at the end of the row, turned with its face to the wall, was a frame the size of the others. She would not have touched it. She had been a servant long enough to know what a thing turned to the wall meant. Argent, however, had followed her as the dog now always followed her, and it went to that turned frame and lay down beneath it and put its long head on its paws and made the low broken sound she had first heard out of the storm. And Eleanor understood that the dog was grieving, and that it had been grieving here at this exact place for a long time. Her name was Clara. She had not heard him come. The Marquess stood at the gallery's far end, and the gray light was behind him so she could not see his face, only the tall, dark shape of him, and the stillness that was his whole language. "You may turn it if you wish," he said. "Everyone wishes to. They do not, because they are afraid of me, but they wish to." A long pause. "Turn it. I find I would rather you knew." She turned the portrait. A young woman looked out of it, fair and laughing, painted with a small gray puppy in her arms, and the puppy was Argent, and Eleanor's breath went out of her all at once. He told her then, in the flat, level voice he used for the things that cost him most, the whole of it. Clara had been his wife of 2 years. She had been with child. There had been a fever in the autumn, the kind that took the strong as readily as the weak, and he had been in London on the business of the estate when the express reached him, and he had ridden through the night the way he had later ride for the dog, and he had come too late, by half a day. She had died asking for him. The child had died with her, and the puppy she had been raising, The greyhound she had loved had howled at her door for a week, and then attached itself to him, the husband who had not come in time. And he had let it, because to send it away would have been to lose the last living thing that had loved her. And he could not. "I do not deserve the creature," he said. "I have always known that." And then, 3 nights before Michaelmas, it ran from me in a storm, the way she ran from me, into that fever I was not here to fight, and I thought I had lost the last of her. Too, he was quiet. The dog made its low sound beneath the portrait, and a seamstress carried it out of a ditch, and brought it back to me, and would not come inside, and would not be thanked. "You will understand," he said, and now at last he came forward into the light, and she saw that his severe face was not severe at all, but only very tired and very carefully held together. "Why, I did not know what to do with you. I had decided to want nothing further in this world. You are extremely inconvenient to that decision." Eleanor did not go to him. She had the wisdom even then not to go to him, for a man who has held himself together for 3 years cannot bear to be touched at the moment the seam shows. She stood where she was, with the grieving dog between them, and the dead wife laughing down out of the canvas, and she said the only thing that was both true and bearable. "I am not here to stand in her place, my lord, no one could. I am only here to stand in my own, if you will let me." "That is a smaller thing, and perhaps an easier one." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached past her, very gently, and turned the portrait of Clara back to face the room, the right way, into the light, where she could be seen and grieved and loved as the dead deserved to be. And Eleanor understood that something had been set down that had been carried a very long way. That night, for the first time when she came down to dinner, he rose from his chair to seat her himself, and his hand at her elbow was warm, and neither of them said a word about it. The trouble, when it came wearing a fine coat and a wide smile, as such trouble always does. Mr. Ristay. Crail arrived at Harrogate uninvited a fortnight after the turning of the portrait, ostensibly to pay his respects to his dying uncle, in truth, to take the measure of the marriage that had cut him from his expectations. Eleanor disliked him within a quarter hour, and did not let it show. He was a handsome man, going soft at the edges with a way of looking at her that catalogued the worn places in her gown and the chap in her hands, and arrived, visibly, at a sum he found amusing. He called her cousin. He pressed her hand a half-second too long, and at dinner, with the Duke too weak to come down and only Eleanor and the Marquis to hear it, he laid out, beneath a great show of family feeling, the thing he had come to say. "You will forgive a blunt man, Stonefield." He turned his wine in the candlelight. "But the county talks, and I would rather you heard it from kin than from strangers. There is a feeling abroad that the match is, shall we say, irregular. A seamstress, a woman who took in mending in the village not 2 months past. People are unkind. They are saying, the old Duke lost his wits at the end, and married his heir to a servant to spite me, and that no court would think twice about setting such a thing aside once he is in the ground." He smiled at Eleanor, warm as a knife. "I tell you only so that you may be prepared, cousin, for the world's cruelty. It is not personal. You seem a perfectly pleasant creature. Yet you must know you do not belong here, and so must they. And a settlement aside, I should think a sensible woman might prefer a quiet competence and her freedom to a lifetime of being the seamstress duchess they laugh at behind their fans." Eleanor set down her fork. The Marquis had gone very still at the head of the table, the dangerous quiet stillness, but she found she did not need him to answer for her, and she did not wish him to. She had been the seamstress they laughed at. She knew exactly how much it weighed, and she had carried heavier. "I took in mending, mister." "Crail," she said, and her voice was perfectly level, "because my father was robbed by a friend he trusted, and I chose honest work over begging from people who would have enjoyed refusing me. I am not ashamed of the needle. I would be ashamed of the begging. As to belonging, I find that I belong precisely where I am asked to stand, and where I do the standing well. which is more than can be said for a great many people born to better collars than mine. She picked her fork back up. You will find the lamb very good. Cook has gone to some trouble. There was a silence at the table that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life, for into it the Marquess made a sound she had never heard from him before. He laughed. It was short and rough. The laugh of a man whose laughing muscles have rusted shut. But it was real, and it was the most significant thing he had ever given her. And across the candlelit table his pale gray eyes met hers and held. Crail's smile curdled at its edges and did not recover for the rest of the meal. Crail, however, was not a man to retreat from a single skirmish, and Eleanor had been right to dislike him, and the cruelty he had threatened in the abstract he set about arranging in fact. The Duke died 10 days later, quietly, in the early morning, with Argent on the floor beside his bed and his son's hand in his. He had time for a few last words. The ones he spent on Eleanor when she was brought to him at the very end were these. I chose well, I am seldom wrong, and I was not wrong in you mind. The dog, mind my son. They are the same animal, the pair of them, and they will both follow you out of any ditch you ask them to. Then he turned his face to the window where the first light was coming, and he was gone. And Adrian became the Duke of Harrowgate, and the smiling nephew became a man with one season's grace, and nothing to lose. What Crail arranged was an evening. The new Duke could not, in the first season of his title and his marriage, refuse to receive the county, and so a great assembly was got up at Harrowgate, the first in the house in 3 years. The candles lit in every window, and the orchestra brought from the city and the whole of the neighborhood's quality arriving in their carriages to inspect the seamstress who had made herself a duchess. Eleanor knew the evening for what it was. So did her husband. He had wanted to refuse it, and she had told him no, that to hide her would be to agree with them, and that she would rather be looked at honestly than protected into a cupboard, and he had looked at her a long moment and said, You are braver than I am, which from him was a vow. She dressed with great care that night in deep green silk, the first new gown of her married life, and she wore no jewels because she had none and would borrow none, and she came down the great staircase into the lit and crowded hall, with her chapped hands gloved and her head high, and the whole room turned to watch the seamstress descend, and the whispering ran along the walls like fire in dry grass. It was Crail who lit the worst of it, of course, moving through the room with his wide smile, planting his small poisons. By the second hour, Eleanor could hear the shape of it everywhere she turned. The soft cruelty of people who have decided in advance what they will find. The seamstress took in mending in the village. They say he was forced to it, by the old man's will. They say it will be set aside before the year is out. She heard a great lady in diamonds say to another, behind a fan and not nearly quietly enough, Poor creature, she does not even know she is a joke. And she heard the other laugh, and she felt the old cold come up in her, the cold of the ditch, the cold of being a problem in other people's houses. And she held her face still and her spine straight, and she did not let them see it land. Her husband saw it land. He always saw. He had been across the room, doing the duty of the host. He had not wanted to be, and Eleanor had lost him in the crowd, and now the orchestra had fallen silent between dances, and Crail had chosen that silence, with a showman's instinct, to make his move. He raised his voice just enough in a circle of the county's most malicious, and let it carry. One pities her truly, Crail said, all warm concern. She cannot help what she is. A servant in silk is still a servant. My late uncle, God rest him, was not himself at the end, and the whole county knows it, and a thing done by a man not in his right mind is a thing that can be undone. I say it, only out of kindness to her. She would be happier, set free of a place she was never made for. That was when the room felt the new Duke crossing it. He did not hurry. That was the thing Eleanor would remember, that he did not hurry, that he came through the parting crowd at his own unhurried pace with his face perfectly composed. The whispering died ahead of him, the way it does ahead of weather. He came to where she stood alone, in her green silk in the middle of all of them, and he stopped at her side, close, his shoulder nearly touching hers. And he turned to face the room, and the smiling nephew at the center of it, and the silence stretched until it rang. "My father," said the Duke of Harrogate, in the level-carrying voice that did not need to be loud, "was in his right mind to the last hour of his life. He chose this woman as my wife, because she is worth 10 of any other in this room, and I married her because I agree with him. She is my wife and my duchess. I will hear nothing further on the matter from any person who wishes to remain welcome under my roof." It was already more than enough. Creel's smile had gone to wax. The room had gone to hell breath. And then the new Duke did the thing that ended it, the thing the county would tell over their dinner tables for a year, the thing that Eleanor herself had not seen coming. He turned from the room to her, and he took her gloved and chapped and ruined hand from her side, and raised it, and he bent his proud head over it, and before all the county he pressed his mouth to the back of her glove the way a man does to a queen. Slowly, deliberately, with his pale gray eyes lifted to her face the whole while. Then he straightened, and he said so that every soul in that silent room could hear it. 8 words, and no more. "This is the only duchess I will have." The orchestra, with excellent instinct, struck up. The room exhaled into motion. And Creel, who had come to take a dukedom, and found instead that he had handed it, with his own 2 hands, an evening it would love its new duchess for, made his excuses within the half-hour and was gone before midnight, and was not, in any season Eleanor lived to see received at Harrogate again. Yet the heart of that night, the part she kept, was not the speech, nor even the kiss, on her gloved hand before the county. It was after, when the last carriage had gone, and the candles were guttering, and the great house had emptied of everyone who did not belong in it. He found her on the terrace where she had gone to be alone with the cold air, and the relief of it, and Argent was with her, leaning against her green skirts, and her husband came out into the dark and stood beside her at the balustrade, and did not speak for a while. "You did not need me to do that," he said at last. "You would have stood there all night, and let them break themselves against you, and never bent. I have seen it. I watched you do it at my own table." He turned to her, and the moon was enough to see his face by, and the careful holding of it was gone. "I did it because I wanted them to know. Not for your protection. You do not need my protection. You have proven that past any doubt. I did it because I've spent 3 years deciding to want nothing, and you have undone the decision, and I find I am glad of it, and I wish the whole world to see whose hand I would rather hold than any other in England." Eleanor's breath had gone shallow. The cold of the ditch was very far away now. "My lord," she began, and he said Adrian, and it was the first time he had given her his name to use, and it landed in her like a key turning. "Adrian," she said. The word was strange and warm in her mouth. "I did not save your dog to win you. I want you to know that I saved him, because he was drowning. I would do it again if you had been a tinker and not a duke, and gotten nothing for it but a cold. I know," he said. "That is precisely why." And he lifted his hand, slowly, giving her every moment to step back. And when she did not step back, he set his palm against her cheek, his thumb at the line of her jaw, and the warmth of him went through her like the first fire after the storm. He did not kiss her. He bent his head until his brow rested against hers, and they stood like that a long time in the cold, with the dog leaning warm against them both, and the great house quiet at last behind them. 2 people who had each decided to want nothing, and had each been overruled by the other. A thing held back on purpose because once spent it could not be unspent, and both of them, for once in their guarded lives, wished to make it last. "Come inside," he said against her hair. The old command. It was not cold now, and it had never, she understood at last, been cold. It had always been this from the very first morning on the wet steps. Come inside. Come in out of the cold. Come where it is warm, and you are wanted. She had simply not been able then to hear it. She came inside. They were happy, which is the hardest thing of all to write, and the thing the world least often grants. And the manner of their happiness was quiet as everything between them was quiet. The new Duchess did not forget the needle. She kept her work-basket in the morning room and mended what wanted mending, with her own hands, Duchess or no, and the county learned to find it charming once the Duke had taught them to, and the farmers' wives whose collars she had once turned came to the great house at Christmas and were given chairs by the fire, and were not made to feel the distance. Her aunt was settled in a warm cottage on the estate with a girl to do the heavy work, and never again woke in the night doing sums against the winter, and lived long enough to hold in the fullness of the following year the small dark-haired child who secured the line past any nephew's reach, and was loved, fiercely and openly, by a father who had once decided to love nothing. And the portrait of Clara stayed in the gallery, turned to the light, where the new Duchess saw to it that fresh flowers were set beneath it in their season. Because a house large enough to hold a great love is large enough to honor the one that came before, and Eleanor was not afraid of the dead woman's laughing, painted face. She understood her. They had loved the same difficult man and the same gray dog, and that was a kinship, not a rivalry, and she let it be one. Argent grew old by the Duchess's fire. On winter evenings when the snow came down past the long windows and the child slept upstairs and the Duke read aloud in his level voice from a book left face up on the morning-room table, the greyhound would lift its head from the hearthrug and cross the room and put its long graying muzzle into Eleanor's hand, the way it had done on the cold morning at the foot of the great steps before any of it, when she had been only the seamstress who would not come inside, and she would put her chapped and ruined and beloved hand into its ruff, and her husband would look up from his book and watch her do it, and neither of them would say anything at all, because everything that needed saying had long since been said, on a terrace in the cold, with the whole world finally watching the right thing. She had carried a drowning dog 3 miles through the worst storm of the autumn, because it was alive and afraid, and she could not do otherwise. And in the doing she had been carried, herself, out of a ditch she had stopped believing anyone would notice her in, into a warm house, with her name over the door, and her hand held by a man who had crossed a crowded room to claim it before all of England. The dog had come to her out of the storm, and in returning him, she had been returned at last to a life she had given up expecting, and a love she had never once thought to ask for, and a fire that did not go out. If Eleanor's journey moved you, stay a moment longer in the warmth of it before you go, and let it remind you that the smallest stubborn kindness can carry a whole life somewhere it never thought to reach. Thank you for staying until the end.